There is a question that Jung never asked directly in his books. He circled around her for decades, returned to her in private letters, in clinical notes, in conversations that his students secretly recorded. The question was not about neurosis. It wasn't about trauma. It was something much more disconcerting. What if the person who feels too much isn't broken? What if she is, unknowingly, closer to the psychic totality than anyone else around her? Think about a specific time in your life. Not now, before, when you were a child, or teenager, or young adult. You were in a room full of people and you felt something that no one else seemed to feel. The tension between two people who pretended to be fine. The weight of a word spoken with a smile. The sadness of someone who insisted that it was great. You felt it in your body. On the chest, sometimes in the throat, and you looked around. No one else seemed to notice. You concluded, as most do, that there was something wrong with you. That feeling so much was in excess. A calibration defect. You've learned over the years to turn the volume down, not to comment on what he perceived. Smiling when the environment called for lightness, even if inside you were carrying the emotional weight of the whole room. This has a name in popular psychology: excessive empathy, extreme sensitivity, high sensitivity. But Jung would not use any of these terms. Jung would look at you and see something else. He would see someone whose psyche has already refused the anesthetic that most people voluntarily accept. Someone who, because he couldn't turn off perception, each was forced to develop a relationship with the unconscious that most never develop, not even with decades of analysis. In other words, he would see someone who has already taken the first step of individuation. The problem is that this step, without guidance, without a map, without understanding what is happening, does not lead to integration. It leads to collapse. It leads to isolation. It leads to the person who feels everything and understands nothing, who absorbs the whole world but does not know who she herself is. That is lost in others precisely because it has never been found by itself. And that's where Jung becomes disturbing, because he saw it, he described it, and he went further. He argued that this kind of person, the empath who doesn't complete the process, must carries the greatest psychic waste there is, the potential for wholeness abandoned halfway. In this video, you will understand why Jung believed that sensitivity is not the problem. It is the portal. You will understand what true individuation is, not the beautiful concept that circulates on the networks, but the brutal, silent, and inevitable process that he described in his densest works. And you will understand where, in this map, most empaths get lost, and why. But there is a caveat. What you're going to hear here won't make you feel any better about being an empath, at least not immediately, because Jungian truth is never comfortable. She is demanding. It points not to what you feel, but to what you still refuse to face. Stay with me. There is a word that Jung used for decades, and that the more you try to simplify it, the more it escapes: individuation. Most people who encounter this term for the first time imagine something related to independence, to being different from others, to standing out from the crowd. But Jung wasn't talking about any of that. He was talking about something far more disturbing, far more demanding, and far rarer than any form of superficial originality. Individuation for Jung was the process by which a human being becomes what he really is. Not what it was molded to be, not the version approved by the family, validated by culture, or tolerated by society. What it really is, with all the contradictions, with all the parts that have been buried, with all the ones that have been rejected over the years of social survival. To understand why this is so rare, you need to understand how Jung viewed the human psyche. He didn't see it as one. He saw it as a field of tension between opposing forces. On one side, the ego, the consciousness, the identity you believe yourself to be, the narrator of your own story. On the other side, the unconscious, vast, ancient, full of everything that the ego has decided not to carry. And in the unconscious, Jung identified something he called the shadow, the totality of the parts of yourself that have been declared unacceptable. Your anger, your jealousy, your ambition that you have learned to disguise as humility, your desire for recognition that you call simple curiosity, your need for love that you have learned to call weakness. The shadow does not disappear when it is ignored. It deepens. And the more the ego rejects you, the more it acts underneath, in the behaviors you can't explain, in the reactions that surprise you, in the patterns that repeat themselves without you understanding why. Individuation begins when a person stops pretending that the shadow does not exist. When she decides, often not by choice but by collapse, to go down there and find what she is waiting for. And here's the point that most people never consider. This process doesn't start in a clinic. It doesn't start with a self-help book. It doesn't start with a spiritual retreat. It begins with suffering, with the rupture of what could no longer be sustained, with the moment when the mask cracks because the face underneath it has grown too long. Jung has observed over decades of clinical practice that most people go through their entire lives without ever truly initiating this process. Not for lack of intelligence, not for lack of spirituality, but because the ego is extraordinarily efficient at finding substitutes for dissent. Routine, consumption, relationships that fill without transforming, work that he occupies without revealing, beliefs that comfort without demanding. The ego has a survival instinct that goes far beyond the biological. He survives psychologically at the cost of never letting you find you for real. And then Jung noticed something that disturbed him deeply. There was one type of person who seemed unable to accept these substitutes, that he couldn't anesthetize himself as easily, that he felt the weight of the unsaid in conversations, the tension beneath the smooth surfaces, the pain that others could ignore. A person who, because he could not turn off perception, was constantly dragged into others, into environments, into layers of reality that most simply do not access. Jung did not use the term empath. This is a contemporary term popularized by a psychology that is still learning to name what it had already mapped out. But the phenomenon was the same, and Jung's conclusion was disconcerting. This person, who carries his sensitivity like a burden, who has spent his whole life trying to protect himself from the excess he feels, who often arrived at the office exhausted, confused, not knowing where it ends and the other begins. This person had already done what most never do. It had already begun, not consciously, not by choice, but the fact that she could not anesthetize herself had kept her in touch with the unconscious in a way that the well-defended ego never allows. She was already within the territory that individuation requires. I was already in the dark, not knowing that that dark had a map. The problem is that being at the beginning of the process does not mean completing it. And that's exactly where the story of the draw gets complicated. There's something no one tells you about being an empath. Not social media profiles, not the articles that list signs that you are highly sensitive, not the videos that treat empathy as a superpower to be celebrated. None of them tell you the uncomfortable part, the part that Jung would have said in the first place, because he never had the patience for comfort that wasn't true. The part that no one tells you is this: feeling the whole world doesn't mean you know yourself. In fact, for many empaths, it's just the opposite. The more you absorb the insides of others, the less clarity you have about your own. When you know what your colleague was feeling in that meeting, you can tell when your partner is angry, even if they smile. You walk into a room and in seconds you have a complete emotional map of the environment. But if someone asks you what you want, what you really feel, what moves you when there's no one else to feel in the place, you freeze. Jung described this mechanism with surgical precision, though not using those words. He talked about what happens when a person develops hypersensitivity to the unconscious of others before they have established a solid relationship with their own ego. The result is a psyche that functions as an antenna without a base, that captures everything, but has nowhere to process it, that receives without filter and therefore confuses what belongs to the other with what belongs to herself. And this is not poetry, it is psychic structure. The empath who has never worked this distinction spends his entire life in a state that Jung would call mystical participation, a term he borrowed from the anthropologist Levi Bruhl to describe a state of fusion between self and other, where the boundaries between subject and object dissolve. In a primitive tribe, this state fulfilled a function. It created cohesion. It allowed the group to move as an organism. But in a modern psyche, without ritualization, without restraint, without an ego sufficiently formed to mediate, this state is a form of slow dissolution, and the empath dissolves. Not all at once, slowly, in the choices he makes for others because he felt what they wanted before he knew what he himself wanted. In the relationships he maintains because he absorbed the pain of the other as if it were his obligation to carry it. In the limits that he never sets because he feels the disappointment of the other even before he finishes the no. There is a specific moment that Jung identified as crucial in the process of individuation, the moment when a person can make the difference between ego and self. The ego is the consciousness, the manager, the narrator. The self is the deepest center, the totality that includes conscious and unconscious. To get to the self, the ego must first be sufficiently defined. It needs to have borders. You need to know where it ends. The empath who has never developed these edges does not reach the self. He reaches chaos. Because without a structured ego, right, the descent into the unconscious that individuation requires is not transformation, it is flooding. And the flood has recognizable symptoms. The exhaustion that does not go away with rest, the feeling of being responsible for the emotions of everyone around, the difficulty of making decisions without first calibrating the impact on each person involved, the silent question that appears in almost every embellex at some point in life. But after all, what do I feel? Not what I absorb, not what I process for others. What is mine, really? Jung would have answered this question with another, even more perplexing one. Have you ever stopped long enough, alone, without external input, without someone to feel, to discover? For most empaths, the answer is no, because being alone without input is terrifying. Not because of loneliness, but because, hooray, in the absence of the other, the empath does not find silence. He finds the unconscious. And the unconscious, without the structure to receive it, speaks of anxiety, of disturbing images, of memories that arise without invitation, of emotions that have no name. What seems to be a symptom is, in Jung's language, a call, the unconscious knocking on the door, saying it's time to get down. The trap is not feeling too much. The trap is to use feeling as an escape from oneself. If there is one concept in Jung that was simultaneously the most cited and the least understood, it is the shadow. It became a metaphor for motivation, the title of a self-help book, a hashtag. And in this process of popularization, it lost exactly what made it disturbing: precision. The shadow is not his dark side in the dramatic sense. Why, it is not necessarily repressed violence or forbidden desire. In strict Jungian terms, the shadow is everything that the ego has declared incompatible with itself and relegated to the unconscious. It is the repository of everything you have been taught not to be. And for the empath, this repository has a very specific and very unobvious composition. Because what most often relegates him to the shadow is not aggressiveness. It is indifference. It is not selfishness. It is the legitimate desire not to feel for the other. It's not cruelty. It is the right to put oneself first without guilt. This is counterintuitive, and Jung knew it would be. Because the shadow is not necessarily dark in the moral sense. It is dark in the sense of hidden, and what a person hides depends on what their story has declared unacceptable. For the empath, who was often raised in an environment where his sensibility was valued, or worse, used, indifference becomes the original sin. Selfishness becomes the unthinkable. The limit becomes betrayal. And then all this capacity not to feel, not to absorb, to say no, to exist for oneself, goes into the shadow. What happens to what goes into the shadow? It does not disappear. He presses. And when it presses hard enough, it erupts, but not in the clean, conscious way of a choice. It erupts at the wrong moments with disproportionate intensity in ways that it later binds it, unable to recognize as its own. It's the tantrum that seems to come out of nowhere after months of helping without receiving. It is the sudden withdrawal of someone who empathizes with him without being able to explain why. It is the exhaustion that does not seem to have a cause, because consciously he was just being who he always was. It is the silent resentment that grows as long as the smile remains. Jung was clear about this. What is not consciously integrated is experienced as destiny. You don't choose your shadow. She chooses the moment to appear. And here the situation deepens even more. Jung observed that what we project onto others, the qualities that irritate us, that fascinate us inexplicably, that disturb us to an intensity that seems exaggerated, is often the shadow in action. The shadow cannot be seen in ourselves, so it is seen in the other. For the empath, this projection has a very particular form. He is often attracted, romantically, amicably, in ways he cannot explain, to people who openly exhibit what he has suppressed. Anawa, the person who says no without guilt, the person who puts his own interests first naturally, the person who doesn't feel everything, who doesn't carry the environment on his back, who seems light in a way that empaths him, secretly craves and consciously judges. He admires and criticizes them at the same time. And this tension, this fascination mixed with judgment, is the signature of the projection of the shadow. The integration of the shadow in the Jungian process does not mean becoming indifferent. It does not mean abandoning empathy. It means recognizing that the ability not to feel for the other, to exist primarily for oneself at certain moments, to set limits without dissolving into guilt. These capacities are yours too. They are in you. They were only declared prohibited. And when they are integrated, something changes irreversibly. The empath that is part of the shadow does not cease to feel, but he gets to choose when to feel it. He begins to have the option he never had. And with this option, empathy ceases to be a compulsion and becomes a virtue. In the original sense of the word, virtues, strength. Without this work, the empath remains in a cycle that Jung would describe as neurosis, the unconscious repetition of a pattern that exists to avoid the shadow, helping too much, forgetting about himself, attracting the same situations, exhausting themselves in the same dynamics. The key is not to feel less. The key lies in what's hidden underneath feeling so much. Jung spent years trying to find a language to describe what happens when a person stops resisting the unconscious and starts listening to it. Not as surrender, not as a collapse, but as a deliberate and frightening act of attention. He used a lot of images: the descent into hell, the night of the sea, the belly of the whale. They all pointed to the same territory, the moment when you stop running away from what's inside and start inhabiting it. For the empath, this moment has a specific texture, because the empath is not running away from the unconscious in the same way as most. He is already there, although without guidance. He already feels the currents. It is already driven by the tides. What is missing is not to enter, it is to learn to swim. And swimming, in this context, means something very concrete: to begin to distinguish what is a signal from what is noise. The empath who has never done this work processes everything with the same intensity. The pain of a stranger in a supermarket queue has the same emotional weight as the pain of a child. A colleague's discomfort in a meeting creates the same internal tension as an intimate conflict. There is no hierarchy. There is no filter. Everything arrives and everything weighs equally, because the ego, without defined borders, cannot calibrate relevance. The compass emerges when the empath begins to develop what Jung would call the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to create a third element out of the tension between conscious and unconscious. It is not intuition in the popular sense. It's something more specific: the ability to be simultaneously in touch with what you feel and with a perspective that observes what you feel. The feeling and the witnessing of the feeling happening at the same time. Yes, this development does not happen spontaneously. It requires what Jung called active work with the unconscious, dreams, active imagination, analysis, any practice that creates a structured channel between the conscious and what is underneath. And it requires above all the willingness to stay with the discomfort without solving it immediately. The empath has a reflex that is very difficult to break, the reflex to solve. He feels the tension in a situation and acts to relieve it. He feels the pain of the other and moves to fix it. He feels disagreement in an environment and works to harmonize it. This reflex, which he learned early and which has been reinforced by years of social approval, is precisely what prevents the development of the compass. Because the compass can only be calibrated in stillness. And stillness only happens when the empath stops solving and starts observing. Jung described a phenomenon he called numinous, the encounter with something that exceeds the ego's comprehension, that carries a charge of meaning that seems to come from outside of rational time and space. For the empath who begins to work on the unconscious, this encounter often happens when he stops reacting to what he feels and begins to ask what the feeling is saying. Not what it caused, not who is to blame, not how to solve it, but what are you saying? The anguish that appears in certain situations begins to reveal patterns. The inexplicable attraction to certain people begins to point to something internal. Chronic burnout begins to indicate where the ego is being subjected to a role that is not its own. Insensibility, being which was constant and undifferentiated noise, begins to organize itself into language. This is what pain turning into a compass means. Not that it disappears, not that he stops feeling it, but that feeling becomes directed. It starts to inform instead of just overloading. It becomes a guiding tool that consistently points to what needs to be integrated, to where growth is requiring movement. Jung believed that the unconscious was not the enemy. He was a partner, the most demanding, the most honest, the most ruthless of partners, but partner. And the empath, who has spent his entire life in forced contact with this territory, has an advantage that he does not recognize. He is no longer afraid of the dark in the same way that others are. He grew up in the dark. He learned to move in it, even without a map. Giving him the map is not teaching him how to feel. It is teaching him to read what he has been feeling for years. Jung was honest about this in a way that few therapists have the courage to be. Individuation is not a comfortable process that ends well if you follow the right steps. It's a process that requires, at some point, that you pay a real price. And the price is not symbolic. It's not metaphorical. It's the loss of something you genuinely didn't want to lose. For the empath, this price has a name, the identity built around caring. There is a fundamental difference, which Jung would have insisted on marking, between caring as an expression of the self and caring as a defensive structure of the ego. In the first case, care emerges from an abundance, of a place that is already known, that has already found itself, or that can give without getting lost in giving. In the second case, care emerges from fear, from the unconscious belief that without the role of caregiver, of sensitivity, of presence that welcomes, there is no place to exist. That love is conditional on emotional utility. Most empaths live in the second case, and that's a difficult claim because it implies that the thing he's most proud of, his ability to feel for another, to be present in a way that most people can't, can be both genuine and defensive. Both things at the same time. And the defensive part needs to be examined so that the genuine part can finally exist freely. But to examine this is terrifying, because it implies questions that undo entire narratives of identity. If I am not the one who cares, who am I? If I set boundaries, will I be loved the same? And if I fail to absorb the pain of the other, does it make me cold, less human, accept me? These questions are the Gethsemane of the empath, the moment when the process demands that it continue and the ego begs to stop. And most stop, not dramatically, no ad. It simply retreats into the familiar. He begins to use the vocabulary of individuation without making the actual movement. It talks about limits without setting them. He understands the shadow theoretically without descending to it, recognizes patterns without interrupting them. This is what Jung identified most clearly as the most sophisticated substitute the ego has found for real transformation. The intellectual understanding of the process as a way of avoiding the process. You can spend years in a Jungian analysis office, read all the books, or know all the concepts, and use it all as a more elaborate armor instead of chipping it away. Jung saw this happen with brilliant analysons, and he was relentless in his observation. Understanding the map is not the same as walking the territory. The cost of stopping in the middle is specific and cumulative. The empath who does not complete the process remains in a state that Jung would describe as psychic inflation, followed by deflation. Cycles in which identification with the caregiver role generates a sense of meaning and worth, followed inevitably by burnout, resentment, and collapse. And then the recovery, and then the repetition. Each cycle costs something. The relationship that was sacrificed on the altar of compulsive caregiving, the years dedicated to saving those who did not want to be saved. When the life project itself that took a back seat because there was always someone who needed it more. And the question that arises, usually late, usually after a crisis that could no longer be ignored, how much time did I spend living the lives of others? Jung called this unlived life. It was for him the most common and silent psychic tragedy that existed. The person who reached the end of his life and realized that he had been faithful to a role, not to himself. That had been present for everyone, except for that inner voice that had been asking for decades to be heard. The empath that stops in the middle does not fail. Failure implies a conscious attempt. He just doesn't know what he's leaving behind. Because the cost of life not lived never comes up all at once. It appears in installments. On nights when something seems wrong without a name. In achievements that should satisfy and do not satisfy. In relationships that should be enough and leave a void that has no explanation. Jung would say that this emptiness is the self calling, insistently, with infinite patience and increasing urgency. Jung was careful when talking about the results of individuation, not because he was vague, but because he had a deep aversion to idealization. He saw what happens when people create romanticized images of transformation and chase them. They chase the image, not the reality. And the image does not transform anyone. So he was needed. Clinical. Honest about what individuation produces and equally about what it does not produce. It does not produce the absence of suffering. The person who has completed a significant arc of the Jungian process still suffers. It still loses. It is still affected by what happens around it. The difference is not in what affects it. The difference is in how it looks in relation to what hits it. For the empath who has gone through the process, who has descended into the shadow, integrated what was hidden, developed edges without losing sensitivity, learned to distinguish what is theirs from what is the other's, something changes irreversibly in the architecture of perception. Empathy remains, but it changes its nature. Before it was involuntary, an opening that could not be closed, a permeability that the environment crossed without asking permission. After integration, it becomes what Jung would call an ego-aided function, something that can be exercised with awareness, with choice, with deliberate presence, rather than automatic absorption. The empath who has reached wholeness feels what the other feels, but is not kidnapped by it. He can enter the emotional world of the other with depth and leave with integrity. You can be fully present in a difficult conversation without carrying the weight of it for days. He can perceive emotional manipulation, which previously captured him without him realizing it, and name it calmly, without reactivity and without cruelty. But there is something else that Jung identified, something that goes beyond emotional regulation and touches a different dimension. He noted that the person who has completed significant work of individuation develops what he called inner authority. Not authority in the sense of power over others, the authority in the original etymological sense, from the Latin auctor, one who makes grow, who originates, a relationship with the center itself that does not need external validation to sustain itself. For the empath, this is radical transformation, because the identity of the empath, before integration, is intrinsically dependent on the feedback from the environment. He knows who he is through the mirrors of others, for approval, for need, for gratitude. When the mirrors disappear, when the relationship ends, when the environment changes, when no one else needs it, it collapses because there is no center of its own solid enough to sustain itself in the absence of the other. After individuation, this center exists, and his existence changes everything that orbits around him. Relationships change. And not because the empath becomes less loving, but because he stops choosing relationships for what they need him for and starts choosing for what he genuinely wants to offer. The difference between these two motivations is huge in terms of the quality of the bond. The first creates codependency. The second creates a real encounter. Two beings who choose to be together, not out of a need to fill a void, but out of mutual recognition of something that exists in each other. The work also changes. The integrated empath can no longer genuinely commit to what makes no sense to him. Tolerance for the meaningless decreases, not out of arrogance, but because contact with the self makes life unlived unbearable in a way that was previously only latent. Jung described this as one of the side effects of the process, the increasing inability to lie to oneself. And there is something quieter, more difficult to articulate, which Jung tried to describe at various points in his work. A certain quality of presence. The human being who has completed a significant arc of individuation carries with him something that affects the environment in a way that is not explainable by behavior or words alone. It's more like a field, a density of being that people feel without being able to name. Jung spoke about this when he observed that the process of individuation does not only benefit the individual, it benefits the collective field. Because each person who becomes whole reduces the amount of unintegrated shadow being projected into the world. When every ego that stops needing enemies to define itself is an ego that stops creating enemies. Each person who has found their center stops stealing the center of others to feel whole. The empath who crosses to the end does not become less sensitive. It becomes more, because sensitivity, now with structure, with choice, with center, can go deeper without getting lost. You can touch what is real in the other without confusing it with what is yours. It can be present in a way that most never experience, neither as a receiver nor as a giver. Jung once said that the most important question a human being can ask is not what is happening to him. It's what he's doing with what's happening to him. The empath who has come this far, who has read this far, who has recognized his own story in one of these portraits, already knows, is somewhere before the words, that sensitivity was not the problem. It never was. It was the invitation. It was the map. The question that remains is always the same one that Jung left with his patients at the end of the denser sessions. Not as a task, as an opening. Will you continue to use what feels like an escape from yourself, or will you finally use it to get there?